They came with a tape and a folding rule to measure the Duke of Renmore for his coffin, and the Duke of Renmore was, at that hour, still breathing. Honora Ashfield, who had been his wife for 3 months and his nurse for the last 9 days, stood in the doorway of the great bedchamber and watched Mr. Dunmore the undertaker unroll his tape along the length of the bed, as though the man beneath the counterpane were already a plank of good oak waiting to be dressed. She did not yet know that this tape, and the small brass-cornered book Mr. Dunmore carried tucked under his arm, would be the first proof she needed, though she would not understand it for what it was until much later, when the nights had grown shorter and colder, and she had learned to read a dying man's household the way her father had once read a fevered pulse. For now she knew only that no one had asked her leave. The physician, Dr. Colborne, stood near the window with his hands folded like a man at a graveside rehearsal. The Duke's cousin, Miss Everard Ashfield, stood nearer still, his voice pitched low and kind, the voice of a man arranging flowers rather than dimensions. 6th of September, he was saying to the undertaker, and quarter day not 3 weeks off. Best to be prepared, Dunmore, for the family's sake, so that grief need not also carry errands. Nora crossed the room before she had decided to cross it. He is not dead, she said. Nobody answered her directly, which was its own kind of answer. Mr. Dunmore straightened, murmured an apology to the air somewhere between the Duchess and the corpse he had been sent to anticipate, and began winding his tape. Dr. Colborne would not meet her eyes, and that told her more than his silence intended. She sat down in the chair that had become, in 9 days, entirely her own, and took her husband's wrist between 2 fingers, and counted, and did not look up again until the room had emptied itself of everyone but the 2 of them, and the September heat pressing at the windows like a hand that wanted in. Gabriel Ashfield, Duke of Renmore, was 2 months from his 30th birthday, and, by the terms of his late father's will, the whole of the unentailed Renmore fortune passed away from him, and toward his cousin Everard entire, and unchallenged if he should die before Michaelmas, without an heir living, or expected. 3 weeks. Nora had done the sum so many times in the last 9 days that the number had stopped feeling like arithmetic and started feeling like weather, a thing pressing down on every hour regardless of what she did inside it. She had married a stranger in a solicitor's parlour in June for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a younger brother who needed bread, and a name that would not open its own doors to a physician's ruined daughter. She had not expected, in June, to spend September counting his pulse against a clock that was also counting his cousin's inheritance. His eyes opened while she counted. They were clouded, the whites gone faintly yellow, and for a moment they did not seem to find her at all. Then his hand closed over hers, with a strength that startled her after 9 days of watching that same hand lie slack on the counterpane. "Don't let them," he said, each word costing him visibly. "Don't let them." The door opened. Everard Ashfield came back in on a waft of orange flower water and quiet consideration, and Gabriel's hand went loose in hers as though a string had been cut, his eyes rolling back into whatever country he had gone to, leaving the sentence standing open like a door in a wind. Nora did not finish it for him. She only sat, and counted, and waited, and told herself that whatever he had meant to say, she would still be sitting in this chair when he found the strength to say it again. She had not always been a woman who sat in duchesses' chairs and refused to be moved from them. 3 months before, she had been Honora Fairweather, 26, mending gloves by candlelight in 2 rented rooms above a chandler's shop in Fenbrook, with an 11-year-old brother to feed, and a father's name that closed more doors than it opened. Dr. Edmund Fairweather had been the best physician in 3 counties until the spring he stood up in a coroner's inquest and swore, on his professional honour, that a wealthy woman had been poisoned by degrees by the nephew who inherited her, and could not prove it to the satisfaction of men who did not wish it proved. He had died 2 winters later, disbelieved and undone, leaving his daughter his instruments, his case-books, and a caution she had absorbed into her bones, that the truth of a body does not care who is convenient to blame. It was Nurse Hale, in fact, who had first carried word of the Duke of Renmore's predicament into Fenbrook, sitting in Nora's cold little parlour, with her knitting clicking like a small persistent clock. His Grace wants a wife by his 30th birthday, or the whole estate slides sideways to that smiling cousin of his, the old woman had said, and he has looked at every eligible lady in the county and found something wanting in each. I told him, go and look where nobody else is looking. That is generally where the worth is kept. Nora had gone to Renmore Hall expecting a fool or a tyrant, and had found instead a large, grave, unhappy man who conducted the entire interview standing at a window with his back half turned, as though he could not bear to be assessed while assessing. You would have security, he had said without preamble, an establishment, a name for your brother, an allowance beyond what either of us will likely need to discuss again. In exchange you would be my wife, in fact, if not. I think we may agree. In any sentiment neither of us has time to manufacture. You make a comfortable case for widowhood, she had said, before she could soften it, since I understand your health is not robust, and the settlements, I am told, improve considerably upon your death. He had turned then, and looked at her properly for the first time, something sharpening in his face that might have been offence, or might, she thought later, have been the first flicker of respect. You think I am buying myself a patient hangman. I think you are buying yourself a wife who will not pretend she has not done the sum. And will you do it? The sum, I mean. Marry a man for the improvement of his death. I did not marry you to bury you, she had said, surprising herself with the heat in it. I have buried enough people I loved for love's sake. I will not do it again for money's. It was Nurse Hale, waiting in the passage with her knitting, who had laughed outright at that, a short bark of approval that made the housemaids jump. Gabriel had not laughed. He had simply nodded, once, as though a ledger had been squared, and said that the settlements would provide for her brother's schooling regardless of what became of either of them, and that he hoped she would not find Renmore too dull a place to be married in. She had not found it dull. She had found it, within the month, a house of very good servants, and one very bad cousin, and had told herself, sitting now in the sick-room chair with her husband's wrist gone slack again beneath her fingers, that whatever else was true, she had meant that sentence in the solicitor's parlour, and meant it still. Everard Ashfield came to find her 3 days later in the small morning parlour, where she had taken to writing letters she did not send, because writing them at least gave her hands work to do. He came in softly, the way he did everything, and set himself down across from her, with the ease of a man arranging his own portrait. "You look tired, cousin," he said, though she was not, by any true reckoning, his cousin at all, only his cousin's wife, a distinction he never quite observed, and she had noticed he never quite observed. "I wonder if you oughtn't rest more, and leave the sitting up to the women who are paid for it. There is talk in the village, you understand, about a young bride so devoted to a dying man's bedside. Talk is unkind to devotion. It prefers to read it backward. Let it read what it likes," she said. It will read that you cannot bear to leave his side, because you cannot bear the thought of losing what marrying him bought you, Everard said, not unkindly, which was the worst of it. His voice was never unkind. Or it will read that you are counting the days until you need not sit there at all. Either reading serves you ill. I only mention it because I am fond of you, in my way, and I should hate to see you made a subject for the servants' hall. You are very concerned with what is said in the servants' hall. I am concerned with what is true in it, he said, and smiled, and the smile did not reach the rest of his face. And Nora filed that away the way her father had taught her to file away an irregular pulse, without comment for later use. Below stairs, she learned from the scullery maid who brought her tea, a wagering book had opened on how many days his Grace had left, the odds shortening daily, Mrs. Grey, the housekeeper, keeping the tally herself, in a ledger she thought no one saw. Nora did not begrudge them their fear dressed as commerce. Fear needed somewhere to sit, same as grief. But that evening, carrying the night's tonic bottle to the light before she let the spoon near her husband's lips, she noticed for the first time a faint white bloom settling at the bottom of the glass beneath the valerian's usual cloudiness, a sediment that had not been there the week before. She said nothing. She only tipped a careful half-inch of the dose into a clean phial, corked it, and set it at the back of her dressing-case beside her father's old instrument tin, the way a woman sets aside a thread that might, pulled gently enough, unravel a whole coat. There were, in the slow procession of that illness, hours that were not dreadful, and Nora came to hoard them the way a miser hoards coin, because she suspected, rightly as it turned out, that there would not be many of them. On the 12th night his fever broke enough that his eyes came back to her clear and stayed clear, and he asked, in a voice gone thin as paper, why she still bothered with the wrist counting when Dr. Colborne had a watch for the purpose. "Your Dr. Colborne's watch cannot feel what my fingers feel," she said. "A pulse is not only a number, it has a shape. My father taught me to read the shape before I could read most books. And what shape is mine tonight?" "Steadier," she said, though still unkind to you. "You did not answer whether it frightens you. It frightens me considerably. I am simply better at sitting still while frightened than most people are." He was quiet a moment, studying her with the particular attention of a man who has nothing else to do but attend. "My father used to say a duke should never let his face report a blow. I have found it useful advice for rather more than dukedoms. My father used to say the body tells the truth even when the household does not," she said. "It is why I trust bodies rather more than I trust households." Something in that struck him as unexpectedly funny, he made a sound that was half a laugh and wholly a wince, pressing 2 knuckles briefly against his sternum where, she had noticed, his hand went whenever pain caught him unawares. An old habit he wore like a scar, though she had not yet learned its history. "Forgive me," he said, "I have not laughed in some while. It appears to hurt rather less than I feared." "Then you are welcome to do it again, if the household affords you cause." "The household affords me very little cause for anything but tonics and tape measures," he said, and this time she laughed too, briefly, guiltily. The sound strange in that stale-aired room, and something eased between them that had not been there in the solicitor's parlour. Some ledger of the heart quietly, and without either of their permission beginning to balance itself in her favour. She did not tell him, that night, about the white bloom in the tonic glass, or the phial hidden in her dressing-case. She told herself she was sparing him alarm he could not afford. She would come to wish, before the month was out, that she had risked the alarm instead. It was Mrs. Grey who found her 3 nights later, with the tonic bottle held up to a candle flame, tilting it this way and that, watching the sediment catch the light. The housekeeper's face went the particular colour of a woman deciding, in the space of a breath, which story to carry upstairs. "Your Grace," she said, "is something amiss with the physic." "I mean to ask, Doctor." Colborne the same, Nora said, which was true, and which did her no good whatsoever, because by morning the story that travelled the house was not that the Duchess had questioned the tonic, but that the Duchess had been discovered tampering with it in the dead of night, alone, unwitnessed, but for a housekeeper too frightened to swear otherwise. Everard came to her that afternoon with an apothecary's chit in his hand, smooth as a card laid face up in a winning hand. "There is a purchase here," he said gently, "from Pruitt's in Fenbrook, some 6 weeks past, for a quantity of arsenical preparation, signed with initials I confess resemble yours rather more than they resemble anyone else's in this house. I do not say you meant harm by it. Women dose their own nerves with all manner of things nobody thinks to ask about, but you understand how such a paper will read, set beside a housekeeper's frightened account and a dying man's failing pulse. I have never set foot in Pruitt's shop," she said. "Then it will trouble you very little to have it examined," he said, and smiled his smile that never climbed past his mouth, and left her standing in the parlour with the particular cold that comes not from being accused, but from watching, for the first time, exactly how carefully the accusation had been built before it was ever spoken aloud. That same night Gabriel's fever spiked worse than it had in a week, and by morning he did not know her face. He knew her face again 2 days later, which was worse in its way than not knowing it, because he knew it well enough to be told what to think of it. Everard had sat with him an hour that morning, while Nora was kept from the room by Dr. Colborne's gentle, apologetic insistence that his Grace needed quiet, and when she was finally let back in, Gabriel's eyes tracked her across the room with something in them she had not seen there before, something wary, something that hurt her more than his fever ever had. "They tell me," he said, with great effort, each word laid down like a stone he was not sure would bear his weight, "that you were found with the tonic, that there is a paper with your hand on it. There is a paper with initials on it. Not my hand. I have never bought poison from Pruitt's or anywhere else, Gabriel, and I would ask you to consider who benefits from your believing that I had. I am considering a great many things I have not the strength to consider properly," he said, and closed his eyes, and the unilateral tenderness that came next was, she would understand only later, the most dangerous kindness he ever offered her. "I think you should go from the house a while, not in disgrace. For your own protection, until this is settled, so that whatever is decided about me need not also decide something about you. You are trying to spend yourself to protect me," she said, "the way you have spent yourself protecting everyone since your brother died, and I will not be protected in a manner that also happens to remove me from the one room in this house where I can do you any good." His eyes opened at that, sharp despite the fever, and for a moment she thought she had gone too far, naming a grief he had never once mentioned to her. "Who told you about my brother? Nurse Hale in pieces over 3 months. You need not answer for a grief I only guessed the shape of." He said nothing further, but he did not send her from the room again that day, and she counted that a victory small enough to be swallowed whole and carried forward, the way her father had once told her to swallow small griefs so they would not choke her on the large ones still to come. That evening Everard found her in the corridor and pressed into her hand, with the softest voice he had yet used on her, a folded bank draft, and the promise of a coach at first light, framed entirely as mercy. "No one need know the particulars," he said. "You take this, you go to your brother, you are spared whatever unpleasantness a formal inquiry might otherwise visit upon a penniless young widow soon to be. I ask nothing in return but that you go quietly, and let the house grieve without a scandal attached to it." She looked at the draft a long moment, long enough that he mistook her stillness for calculation of the sum. "I did not marry your cousin to bury him," she said, "and I will not leave him to be buried quietly by you either," and she put the draft back into his hand and folded his fingers over it herself, and watched something flicker behind his composed face that was not quite anger and not quite admiration, and was, she thought afterward, the first look he had ever given her that told the truth. The truth, when it came for her 3 days later, came dressed as procedure. Sir Aldrich Thorne, the family's trustee under the old Duke's will, arrived a full week ahead of Michaelmas to review the household in advance of the formal certification, and found waiting for him a housekeeper's sworn account, an apothecary's chit, and a cousin's carefully sorrowful summary of a young duchess whose devotion had begun, in recent days, to look less like grief and rather more like arithmetic. Sir Aldrich was not an unkind man, but he was a careful one, and carefulness, applied to a story built as neatly as Everard's, produced exactly the result Everard required. Nora was informed, with courtesy and without apology, that she would take her meals and her rest apart from the sick-room until the inquiry concluded, that Mrs. Grey would resume sole charge of the tonic, and that this was, Sir Aldrich assured her, no judgment upon her character, only prudence, the same prudence that measured a coffin for a man still breathing, rather than risk being unready. Nora sat alone in her rooms that night, with the shuttered windows holding in the last of September's heat, and turned her father's instrument tin over and over in her hands without opening it, because she could not yet think what proof she held that would answer a signed paper and a frightened servant's word. It was near midnight when Nurse Hale let herself in without knocking, closed the door soft as a held breath, and set upon the table a single folded letter, its wax broken and carelessly resealed. "I do not read another man's post as a rule," the old woman said, "but I have known that boy since he was in short coats, and I have never once liked the shape of his mouth when he thinks no one is watching it. This went out with tonight's post for London, and I confess my fingers were clumsier than usual opening it." Nora unfolded it with hands that had gone very steady, the particular steadiness her father had, called the hands of a physician who has stopped hoping and started working. It was addressed to a solicitor in London, and it discussed, in Everard Ashfield's own unhurried hand, arrangements befitting the new Duke, morning stationery, a suitable interval before any formal announcement, all of it dated 3 days hence, a full week before Michaelmas, a full 10 days before any physician in the house had pronounced the matter settled. "He has written his cousin's death before it has happened," Nora said, very quietly, and Nurse Hale's needles, for once, went entirely still in her lap. Then, "Your Grace," the old woman said, "I should think it is past time somebody wrote the truth instead, and read it where he cannot smile his way around it." They had 2 days before Michaelmas, and Nora spent them the way her father had once spent the worst weeks of his career, in small, unglamorous increments of proof. Dr. Colborne, shown the letter and the phial of tonic, and the pages of her father's casebook, describing, symptom by symptom, the slow arsenical wasting he had once sworn to under oath, and been ruined for swearing to, went the colour of tallow, and admitted, shamed, that he had prescribed only valerian, and had never once thought to question who compounded the nightly dose after it left his hands. "I trusted the housekeeping of a great house," he said, "the way one trusts the tide to come in. It did not occur to me that the tide itself might be poisoned. Mrs. Gray, cornered in her own still room by Nurse Hale's flat, unblinking stare, and Nora's quiet, level questions, wiped her hands again and again on her apron, and would not at first say more than that Mr. Ashfield managed the household accounts, and she followed instruction as any servant must. But when Nora laid the poison register beside a laundry list bearing the housekeeper's true, halting, ill-schooled hand, the forged signature on the chemist's page, suddenly obvious for the fluent, confident thing it was, something in Mrs. Gray's face broke open like ice going in a thaw. "I never signed for arsenic in my life," she said. "I cannot hardly sign my own name without my lips moving. He told me it was for the rats in the old stable block, and I fetched it because he asked kindly, and because he pays better than a housekeeper's place generally allows, and I did not ask why a house with a rat-catcher on retainer 20 years needed more than that." She would say no more that night, but it was enough, Nora thought, walking back through the darkened gallery with the register under her arm, to build a floor a man might finally be made to stand on in the light. Sir Aldrich Thorne, when shown the letter to London and told the whole of it plainly, went very still himself, and said only that he had come to Renmore to certify a succession, and would, it seemed, be certifying something rather more serious instead, and that he would hear it properly, before witnesses, on Michaelmas morning, as the old Duke's will in fact required him to gather the household regardless. Gabriel, when Nora was at last let back into his room that final night before Michaelmas, was too weak to be told the whole of it, but she told him what she could, sitting close, her hand at his wrist counting the shape of him, and when she finished he was silent so long she feared she had lost him again to the fever. Then his fingers tightened, faint but sure, around hers. "Finish it," he said. "Whatever I meant to say the day they measured me, finish that too, when this is done. I find I would like to hear the end of both sentences." "You will hear the end of both," she said, "if you will only keep breathing long enough for Michaelmas to arrive, and outside the shuttered window a single wren, the same one that had nested each September in the ivy below the sill since before either of them was born to this house, sang its short evening phrase into the thick, waiting dark, and did not know or care what the household inside was counting toward. Michaelmas came in on a morning so still it seemed the weather itself had been asked to hold its breath, and by noon the great hall of Renmore stood filled with more witnesses than it had held since the old Duke's funeral, Sir Aldrich Thorne seated behind the long oak table, with the estate's ledgers stacked before him, Dr. Colborne pale and upright at his shoulder, Mrs. Gray wringing her apron near the door, as though she might yet bolt through it, and near the back, arrived that morning from the county to see, she had told anyone who asked, what manner of woman had married a dying duke for his fortune. Miss Delphine Rose stood with her gloved hands folded, and her face composed into the particular polite cruelty of a woman certain she already knew the stories, ending. Nora stood before the table with her father's casebook under one arm, and the poison register under the other, and did not look toward the door, because she had promised herself she would not hope too visibly for what she had arranged, and could not be certain would come. It came. The doors opened, and Gabriel Ashfield, Duke of Renmore, walked into his own hall on Nurse Hale's arm and a borrowed cane, grey and thinned and unmistakably, gloriously alive. 2 days of broth smuggled to him free of any hand but Nora's own, having done what a fortnight of tonics never had. A sound went through the assembled household that was not quite a gasp and not quite a sob, and somewhere near the door Everard Ashfield's face, for one unguarded instant, showed something that was neither grief nor welcome, but a naked, staggering arithmetic undone. Sir Aldrich called the room to order, and Nora, when her turn came, did not raise her voice, because her father had taught her that the truth does not require shouting, only demonstrating. She uncorked the phial of tonic she had kept hidden since the 12th night, tipped a careful measure into a spoon, and held the spoon over a candle flame until the liquid steamed and thinned and unmistakably released into the still hall the faint, sharp reek of garlic that has no business rising from valerian and honey. "My father taught me this test before I was 10 years old," she said into the silence that followed. Because he had learned, at great cost to himself, that the body does not lie, only the men who dose it. This tonic has been carrying more than sleep in it for some weeks now. She laid the poison register open upon the table beside a laundry list in Mrs. Gray's own halting hand, the forged signature, and the true one side by side in the candlelight for any man in the room to compare, and then she read aloud, in a voice that did not shake, the letter addressed to a London solicitor, dated 3 days before this very morning, discussing mourning stationery for a duke not yet dead. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and total, the kind of silence a room makes only once. It was Sir Aldrich who put the question, not unkindly, to the housekeeper still wringing her apron by the door. "Mrs. Gray, you have kept this house honestly 20 years by every account I have gathered. I ask you once, and I would have you answer as though your soul depended on the answer, which perhaps it does. Who told you to buy for rats, in a house that has kept a rat-catcher on retainer since before you came to service here?" Mrs. Gray's composure, held together through every private question, went to pieces entirely under that public one. "Mr. Ashfield," she said, the words tearing out of her, "Mr. Ashfield told me, and paid me, and told me it was kindness, that the old man was suffering, and would only suffer longer without it, and I am an old fool who believed him, because he has a gentle voice, and I did not want to think a gentle voice could carry poison in it." And she wept then, openly, the apron finally abandoned in her hands. Every eye in the room turned to Everard Ashfield, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his composure, so carefully worn these 3 months, sliding from his face like water off polished stone. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its softness entirely. "My father built half this estate's fortune with his own hands, and died disinherited by a whim of the old duke's. One clause of paper deciding he should have nothing, and his brother's son should have everything, and I have worn his mourning ring every day since, and told myself I would not let paper decide my worth the way it decided his." He touched the ring at his hand as he said it, a habit Nora realized she had seen a dozen times and mistaken for vanity, and understood now for the grief it truly was. "I did not want him dead for hatred, Duke. I wanted, once in my life, for the paper to favour me instead of him." Gabriel, leaning on his cane, regarded his cousin a long moment with an exhaustion that had nothing left in it of triumph. "I am sorry for your father," he said. "I did not know the wound ran that deep, and I am ashamed I never troubled to ask. But you have tried to kill a man for a grievance that was never his to answer, and mercy, Everard, is the only thing I have left to offer you that you have not already forfeited by trying to take everything else. There would be no magistrate, no public trial to drag the family name through further scandal than it had already survived. There would be, instead, passage abroad within the fortnight, an annuity sufficient to keep him from want, and insufficient to keep him from remembering exactly what it had cost him, and a condition, absolute and unnegotiable, that he never set foot again within 100 miles of Renmore. "It is not kindness to you," Gabriel said, quietly, as the room began at last to breathe again. "It is kindness to your mother, who need not learn her son was nearly a murderer, and to this house, which has buried enough grief without adding a scaffold to the churchyard." Mrs. Grey, weeping still, was dismissed without charge, and without a character that named the cause, Sir Aldrich judging, and Nora agreeing, that fear paid for by a gentle voice was a lesser sin than the voice that had purchased it. Near the back of the hall, Delphine Rowe crossed the floor in the general murmuring aftermath, and, to her own visible surprise, found herself curtsying to the Duchess of Renmore. "I came this morning to watch a fortune hunter unmasked," she said, low enough for only Nora to hear. "I find I have watched something else entirely, and I am ashamed of the seat I chose to watch it from. I hope you will allow me in time to earn a better one." Autumn came properly to Renmore within the week, the heat breaking at last in a single hard night of rain that rattled the ivy where the wren had nested and left the whole valley smelling of wet stone and turned earth by morning, and it was in that washed, quiet light that Gabriel found his wife in the small parlour where she had once written letters she never sent. He was steadier on his feet each day now, the wasting slowly reversing itself the way a tide reverses, and he came and stood before her chair rather than at his habitual window, which she understood by now to be his way of saying that whatever he meant to say next, he meant to say it looking at her. "You never finished your sentence," he said, "the one you began the day they measured me for a box I was not yet ready to fill. I said I would still be sitting in that chair when you found the strength to finish yours instead. Then I will finish mine first, since I began it. Don't let them measure me for anything again, while there is breath left to argue with the tape." He paused, and something in his grave face eased into an expression she had come, in the space of a season, to treasure above every other. "And I will add what I did not have strength to add that day. I did not marry you to be buried by a stranger's convenient hand. I find, rather too late to be graceful about it, that I have come to want to be lived beside, by you specific, for reasons that have stopped having anything to do with wills or clauses or quarter days at all. Marry me again, Nora, not in a solicitor's parlour this time. Properly, in the church, with the whole valley to witness it, if you will have a man whose family very nearly cost you your good name. I did not marry you to bury you," she said, and found, saying it this second time, that the sentence had entirely changed its meaning without changing a single word, and I certainly do not intend to stop now, when the sitting up has finally become worth doing. He laughed then, freely, the sound no longer costing him a wince, and it was, she thought, the finest thing she had yet heard in that house. They were married again 3 weeks later in the small stone church at Fenbrook. No great gathering, no measured processions, only the household and a handful of neighbours, and Nurse Hale weeping frankly into a handkerchief she had knitted the border of herself, and Delphine Rowe standing witness beside a blushing, awkward Sir Aldrich Thorne, whose son, it would later emerge, had taken rather more than a passing interest in the lady's reformed company. Dr. Colborne, humbled and quietly determined to be of some real use before he died, worked with Nora through that winter to found a small dispensary in Fenbrook, its doorplate lettered, at Gabriel's insistence, with a name the county had once been taught to distrust, the Fair Weather Dispensary. in memory of a physician who had told an inconvenient truth and paid for it in every coin but thee. Truth's own vindication, which his daughter had finally collected on his behalf. Mrs. Gray wrote once, the following spring, from her sister's cottage, 2 counties off, a short, careful letter thanking the Duchess for a mercy she said she had not earned, and would spend what remained of her life trying to. Of Everard Ashfield there was, by design, almost nothing more to say. A single letter arrived from the continent near Christmas, unsigned but for the pressed outline of a ring no longer worn, and Gabriel read it once, alone, and never spoke of its contents to anyone at all. A year turned, nearly to the day, and the wren came back to nest in the ivy below the same window where a tape had once been unrolled across a dying man's bed. And this time, when the measuring tape appeared in that room, it was in the hands of the Fenbrook dressmaker, stretched not the length of a coffin, but the small, astonishing length of a christening gown, while Gabriel Ashfield stood at the window he no longer needed to hide behind, watching his wife laugh at something Nurse Hale had said, one hand resting, unconsciously, protective, over the new and living weight beneath her heart, and the wren outside sang its short evening phrase into a house that had, at last, stopped counting its days, and started simply living them. If this story warmed you, if you found yourself, somewhere in that long sick-room vigil, rooting for the overlooked woman who refused to leave the chair she had claimed as her own, then stay a while longer by the fire with me. The kettle is on, the candle is lit, and there is always a chair kept warm here for one more listener. Tell me, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest, the tape unrolled too soon, or the sentence Nora waited a whole season to finish. And if you would like more evenings like this one, consider staying on, subscribing, keeping your place among the small company that gathers here to hear the overlooked ones proven right at last. Until next time, sleep well, and be gentle with the ones who sat beside you when no one else thought to stay.